By the time the last document was signed, the silence in the boardroom was worth more than the company itself, but the laughter was deafening when Julian told Elara she was being cut out. It had started not with a bang, but with the clink of a crystal glass against a heavy oak dining table. Her father, Richard, had called a special family dinner. The air was thick with the scent of roasted duck and expensive wine, a smell Elara had always associated with impending doom. She sat quietly, a ghost at her own feast, while her sister, Clara, shone like a newly minted coin under the chandelier. Clara was all light, all brilliance, a supernova of charisma that had always left Elara in the orbital debris. Julian, her fiancé, sat beside Clara. His hand rested casually on the back of her sister's chair, a gesture so proprietary and comfortable that a cold knot formed in Elara's stomach. He was supposed to be hers. His hand was supposed to be on her chair, but Julian, like everyone else, orbited the brightest star. He caught Elara's eye and gave her a small, pitying smile, the kind one gives a child who has just dropped their ice cream. It was a smile that said, "You just don't get it, do you?" Richard cleared his throat, the sound commanding immediate silence. He was a man who dealt in pronouncements, not conversations. "As you all know," he began, his voice echoing with the self-importance of a man who had never been told no. "Sterling Industries is on the cusp of a new era. A merger with Titan Corp is imminent. It will make us the largest chemical engineering firm in the nation." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "To facilitate this, to present a unified front, we are restructuring the family's holdings." Elara felt her breath catch. She knew what was coming. She had felt it in the subtle shift of conversations, the way doors would close softly as she approached, the sudden hush in rooms she entered. She was an inconvenient variable in their grand equation. "Clara will be taking a new role as executive vice president," Richard announced, beaming at his favored daughter, "and Julian, as her future husband and a brilliant strategist in his own right, will be joining the board." The small, curated audience of family confidants and a few key executives murmured their approval. Elara looked at Julian, searching his face for any sign of remorse, any flicker of the man who had proposed to her just 6 months ago. She found none. He was looking at her father, his expression one of pure, triumphant ambition. He had won. He had secured his place in the sun. "And Elara," Richard said, his tone softening with a practiced false sympathy that was more insulting than outright cruelty. "We have a generous severance package for your minority shares. It's time for you to step away, my dear. Business of this magnitude, it's not your world." The papers were already there, resting beside her plate in a sleek leather portfolio. A contract, an execution order for her small piece of her grandfather's legacy. Julian finally turned to her, his voice smooth and condescending. He reached across the table, not to touch her hand, but to tap the portfolio. "It's for the best, Elara," he said, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. The words sliced through the air, each one a tiny, perfect shard of ice. "You've always been more of a background detail. This is for people who live in the light." A few people tittered, a cruel, polite sound. Clara smirked into her wineglass. Her father nodded, as if Julian had just spoken a profound truth. A background detail. The phrase hung in the air, a perfect summation of her entire existence. She was the shadow that proved her sister's light was real. She didn't cry, she didn't scream. The shock was too deep, a cold, heavy thing that settled in her bones. She felt a strange sense of calm descend, the kind that comes when the worst thing you can imagine has finally happened. There was nothing left to fear. She looked at their smiling, triumphant faces, the faces of the people who were supposed to love her, and she felt nothing but a vast, empty silence. She didn't defend herself. She didn't argue. Her restraint was a vacuum into which their arrogance poured, filling every available space. They saw her silence as weakness, as acceptance. They had no idea it was the sound of a lock clicking into place. She simply looked at the papers, her mind a blank slate, and gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. This quiet submission was her only move, the only one she had left. But in that silent nod, a promise was made, a promise only she could hear. They were laughing now, but a day would come when they would remember this moment, and the silence would be theirs. The drive home was a blur. The city lights smeared across her windshield like wet paint. Julian hadn't come with her. He was celebrating, of course, with his real team, his real future. Elara's apartment felt cold and foreign, a place where a different, more naive woman had lived. A woman who had believed in love, in family, in loyalty. That woman was gone now, left behind at that gleaming mahogany table. She walked to a closet in the spare bedroom, a room she rarely used. On the top shelf, covered in a thin layer of dust, was a simple pine box. It wasn't locked. It didn't need to be. Its contents were valuable only to her. She lifted it down, the wood smooth and familiar under her fingers. Inside, nestled in yellowed tissue paper, were her grandfather's things. Harold Sterling, the man who had built the company from nothing, the man whose genius they were all living off of, had been the only one who had ever truly seen her. A wave of grief, sharp and sudden, washed over her. It wasn't for Julian or the betrayal. It was for him, for the loss of the one person who had understood her quiet nature, not as a flaw, but as a strength. "They see the glitter, Ellie," he used to tell her, his voice a low rumble as they sat in his workshop, surrounded by the smell of machine oil and old paper. "You see the gold. Never forget where the real value is buried." Her father had seen Harold as a brilliant but eccentric relic. Clara had found him boring. They were interested in the fruits of his labor, the money, the status. Elara had been interested in the labor itself. While Clara was at ballet recitals, Elara was learning about tensile strength and chemical catalysts. While Richard was schmoozing investors, Elara was sitting with Harold, poring over blueprints and supply chain logistics. He had taught her the company's soul, its very DNA, while her father and sister were busy decorating the body. She pulled out the journals first. There were a dozen of them, bound in worn leather, filled with his spidery, precise handwriting. They were a record of his life's work, a map of his mind. Mixed in with chemical formulas and business projections were his thoughts, his philosophies, his warnings. "A company is a living thing," he had written in one entry. "Its foundation isn't concrete and steel, it's integrity. The moment you compromise that, it begins to rot from the inside out." She ran her fingers over the brittle pages. For years she had studied these journals out of love and remembrance. She had memorized his processes, his theories, his long-term vision for the company that he had never had a chance to realize. She did it to keep him close, a secret conversation with the only person who had ever made her feel seen. She had never imagined it could be a weapon. Beneath the journals was a collection of old documents, original supplier contracts, early patents, and at the very bottom, a rolled-up, heavy piece of parchment tied with a faded red ribbon. It was a land survey, dated 1958. It depicted the large tract of industrial land upon which the entire Sterling Industries campus now sat. She had looked at it 100 times, thinking it was just a historical curiosity, a memento of the company's humble beginnings. She had never understood its true significance. Until now. Her phone buzzed on the table. It was Julian. She ignored it. Another buzz. A text this time. "We need to talk about the signing tomorrow. Don't make this difficult, Elara." Difficult, as if she were a stubborn child refusing to take her medicine. The rage that had been simmering deep inside her finally began to boil. It was a cold, clean anger, clarifying and sharp. The grief was burning away like mist, leaving behind a core of pure, unyielding steel. She picked up her phone, not to answer him, but to call the one person she could trust. Sarah, her best friend since college, a razor-sharp forensic accountant who had always seen the rot in Elara's family. "Sarah," Elara said, her voice steady, devoid of the tears Sarah was probably expecting. "I need your help. I think my family is about to sell a company they don't entirely own." There was a pause on the other end, and then Sarah's voice, low and thrilled. "Well, well, well. It looks like the background detail is about to step into the spotlight." The game had begun. Sarah arrived less than an hour later, a bundle of energy and righteous fury, carrying a laptop and 2 large coffees. She took one look at Elara's calm, determined face and skipped the condolences entirely. "Okay," she said, setting up on the dining table that now felt like a war room. "Show me what you've got." Elara laid out the journals and the old survey. For the next several hours, they worked. Elara translated her grandfather's technical shorthand and personal anecdotes, while Sarah cross-referenced dates and figures with what she could pull from Sterling Industries' public financials. A picture began to emerge, one of slow creeping decay. "He was a genius," Sarah murmured, staring at a page in one of the journals where Harold had detailed a cost-saving refinement process for one of their core chemical compounds. "This is brilliant. Why aren't they using this?" According to their last quarterly report, their production cost on this compound is 30% higher than it should be. "Because my father thought it was too slow," Elara explained, a dull ache in her chest. "He wanted faster output, higher volume. He said Grandpa was too cautious, too obsessed with quality over quantity. He replaced the old machinery, changed the formula slightly to speed up the reaction time. And compromised the stability," Sarah finished, typing furiously. "There have been 3 recalls on products using that compound in the last 5 years. Small ones, kept quiet. But the liability is there. Titan Corp's due diligence team must be asleep at the wheel if they missed this." It was a pattern, repeated over and over. Repeated. Harold's meticulous, sustainable long-term plans had been systematically dismantled by Richard's short-sighted greed and Clara's obsession with marketing and flashy, unprofitable vanity projects. The company was a hollowed-out shell, painted to look like a fortress. "They're desperate for this merger," Sarah concluded, leaning back. "They're not just expanding, they're seeking a bailout. Titan's cash infusion is the only thing keeping them from collapsing under the weight of their own debt and inefficiency." This realization didn't bring Elara any joy. It was a confirmation of a deep, unspoken sadness she had carried for years. They were destroying her grandfather's life's work. The betrayal wasn't just personal, it was a desecration of his memory. "But what about the survey?" Sarah asked, tapping the old parchment. "What's the play here?" Elara picked it up, her mind racing back through years of conversations with Harold. He had been a man of contingency plans, of safeguards. He didn't trust his son's business acumen. He must have built a firewall somewhere. She looked at the survey, at the neat lines and faded ink. It showed Plot 7B, the core of the industrial park. And then she saw it, a small annotation in the corner, in her grandfather's hand. "See File H-17, Personal Holding." It wasn't a company asset. It was his. "He never folded the land into the corporate assets," Elara whispered, the enormity of it dawning on her. "The factory, the labs, the headquarters, they're all sitting on land he owned personally." "So there has to be a lease agreement somewhere, right?" Sarah said, leaning in, her eyes wide. "The company must be paying rent to his estate." "Not to the estate?" Elara said, her memory finally clicking into place. A conversation from years ago when she was a teenager. Her grandfather complaining about paperwork. "Have to renew the lease with myself," he had grumbled. "Lawyers insist. $1 a year for 99 years. Keeps it clean." $1 a year. It would never show up as a significant expense. It would be buried in miscellaneous administrative costs, forgotten by everyone. "We need to find that lease," Elara said, her voice firm. "And we need to find out who inherits his personal holdings. His will was read years ago. My father and I got shares in the company. My grandmother got the house. The land was never mentioned." "Maybe there was a codicil," Sarah suggested, "or a separate trust. We need a lawyer, a good one, not your family's corporate stooges." Elara knew just the person, Arthur Albright. He had been her grandfather's personal lawyer and friend for over 40 years. Richard had unceremoniously fired him a month after Harold's death, replacing him with a slick, expensive firm that was better at hiding problems than solving them. Mr. Albright was old school, a man of integrity, just like her grandfather. If anyone knew about Harold's secrets, it would be him. The next morning, Elara felt a strange sense of purpose. The fog of shock and hurt had lifted, replaced by a crystalline clarity. She was no longer a victim being acted upon. She was an agent, moving with intent. She ignored the barrage of texts from Julian and Clara, demanding to know when she was coming to the office to sign the papers. Let them sweat. She met Mr. Albright in his dusty, book-lined office, a place that smelled of old paper and quiet dignity. He was a small, stooped man with eyes that were still sharp and intelligent behind thick glasses. He listened patiently as Elara laid out the story, his expression shifting from sympathy to a grim, focused intensity. When she finished, he was silent for a long moment. He looked at the journals she had brought, his hand hovering over one as if touching a sacred object. "Harold Sterling was the finest man I ever knew," he said softly, "and the smartest. He saw this coming. In a way, he's been preparing you for this your entire life." He rose slowly and walked to a large fireproof filing cabinet in the corner. He worked the combination lock, the clicks echoing in the silent room. He pulled out a thick, worn file. "File H17, he said, a small, triumphant smile playing on his lips. "Harold entrusted his personal papers to me before he passed. He said there would come a day when his granddaughter would need them." He laid the file on his desk. Inside was the original lease agreement, a 99-year lease for Plot 7B, granted to Sterling Industries for the sum of $1 per year. It was signed by Harold Sterling as the lessor and Harold Sterling as the president of the company. And there, in black and white, was the expiration date. It was set for the day after tomorrow, coinciding with the planned merger announcement. "My God," Sarah breathed, who had come along for the meeting. "He timed it." "Harold was a meticulous planner," Mr. Albright said. "He knew Richard's character. He built a dead man's switch into the heart of his company." But the most important document was at the very back of the file, sealed in a heavy manila envelope. It was a legally binding codicil to Harold Sterling's will. It stated, in clear and unambiguous terms, that all of his personal land holdings, specifically Plot 7B, were to be bequeathed not to his son, but to the grandchild who demonstrated a true understanding of his life's work, to be determined by the executor of his personal trust, Arthur Albright. "He left it to me to decide, Mr. Albright said, his voice thick with emotion. "But he also left me a letter of instruction. It said, 'Give it to the one who cherishes the roots, not just the branches. Give it to Elara.'" He then produced a second document, newer and crisper than the others. "I executed the transfer of title into your name the day after his funeral, as per his wishes. I was instructed to keep it sealed and unannounced until a moment of existential threat to the company's integrity. I believe that moment has arrived." Elara stared at the deed. Her name was printed in neat black ink. Elara Sterling, owner of the land that was the bedrock of her family's entire empire. She was not a background detail. She was the foundation. "What about Julian and Clara?" Elara asked, her thoughts turning from defense to offense. "Sarah found evidence of embezzlement. They've been using corporate funds as their personal piggy bank." "We can use that," Sarah said, her eyes gleaming. "We can build a complete forensic audit. It'll take me a day, maybe less, now that I know what to look for." Mr. Albright nodded slowly. "A two-pronged attack. We invalidate the merger by revealing the company's primary physical asset is not theirs to sell. Then, we expose the corruption at the top. We won't just stop them, we will dismantle them." The plan was set. Sarah would work feverishly on the audit. Mr. Albright would prepare the legal documents for presentation. Elara's job was the hardest. She had to go back into the lion's den and play the part of the defeated, compliant little girl. She had to let them believe they were winning. That evening, she finally answered Julian's call. Her voice was quiet, hesitant, everything he expected it to be. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I was just processing everything. I'll come in tomorrow morning to sign." "Good," he said, his relief palpable. He didn't even bother to hide his condescension. "I'm glad you're being sensible. Don't worry, Elara, I'll still take care of you. You can plan the wedding, host parties, you'll be a lovely wife. It's a role you're much better suited for than business." It was the final act of cruelty, the final twist of the knife. He was offering her a gilded cage, a life as his pretty, useless accessory after taking everything that mattered to her. The words dripped with a smug certainty that he held all the cards, that her only value was in her proximity to him. Any lingering shred of doubt she might have had about the path she was on vanished. He wasn't just misguided, he was cruel. And he, Clara, and her father deserved everything that was coming to them. "Of course, Julian," she said, her voice a perfect imitation of submission. "I understand." She hung up the phone, her hand steady. The trap was set. All she had to do now was wait for the predators to walk into it, lured by their own greed and arrogance. The silence on her end of the line was no longer about fear. It was about patience, the patience of a hunter waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The next 24 hours were the longest of Elara's life. She moved through her day in a state of suspended animation, a quiet storm gathering just behind her eyes. She met with Sarah and Mr. Albright one last time, reviewing the final damning evidence. Sarah had compiled a devastatingly thorough audit, complete with copies of falsified expense reports, invoices for lavish personal trips disguised as business travel, and wire transfers from corporate accounts to Julian's personal offshore entity. It was a masterpiece of financial destruction. Mr. Albright had prepared a neat professional portfolio containing the land deed, the lease agreement, and the codicil to Harold's will. It was the bomb, and Elara was the one who would carry it into the room. Julian had called again, his voice oozing with false charm. "The big meeting is tomorrow at 10, he'd said. "We'll have you sign the papers just before the Titan team arrives, a formality to show them a united front." He wanted a performance. He wanted to parade her defeat in front of everyone, a final confirmation of his victory. He was unknowingly handing her the perfect stage. That night, Elara couldn't sleep. She sat in the dark, holding one of her grandfather's journals. She wasn't reading it. She was just drawing strength from it, from the memory of the man who had believed in her. She thought about the years of being overlooked, of her ideas being dismissed as quaint or impractical. She remembered every condescending pat on the head from her father, every dismissive wave of the hand from Clara, every patronizing smile from Julian. The pain had accumulated over a lifetime, a debt of 1,000 tiny cuts. Tomorrow, that debt would be paid in full. The morning of the meeting, she dressed with deliberate care. She chose a simple, severe navy blue dress. It was the kind of outfit a background detail would wear, unobtrusive, professional, forgettable. She pulled her hair back into a tight, neat bun. She wore no jewelry, save for a small, simple watch. She wanted them to see her exactly as they had always seen her, plain, quiet, and utterly powerless. The contrast would make the impact that much greater. She arrived at Sterling Industries headquarters at 9:30. The building, her grandfather's building, felt different today. She wasn't just a minority shareholder anymore. She was its foundation. The receptionist gave her a pitying look as she signed in. The whole office was buzzing with rumors about the merger, about Clara and Julian's ascension. Elara was seen as yesterday's news, a casualty of progress. She walked to the executive floor. The door to the main boardroom was open. Inside, her father, Clara, and Julian were laughing with a few of their crony board members. They were celebrating before the deal was even done. Clara saw her first. Her smile was sharp and predatory. "Elara, so glad you could make it. Don't be nervous, it's just a signature." Julian came over and put an arm around her shoulder, a gesture of ownership that made her skin crawl. "There she is," he said to the room, "ready to do her part for the family. We appreciate you being so cooperative." He steered her toward the head of the massive mahogany table, where the share transfer documents were laid out, waiting for her signature. Her father watched, his face a mask of smug satisfaction. "Let's get this done before the Titan executives get here," Richard said, his voice brisk and impatient. He pointed to the line at the bottom of the page. "Sign here, Elara." This was it, the moment of truth. The air in the room was thick with anticipation and triumph, their triumph. Elara took a deep breath, the scent of expensive coffee and self-congratulation filling her lungs. She looked at the faces around the table, smirking, condescending, dismissive. They were so sure they had won. She walked to the table. She picked up the pen. Julian's smile widened, but she didn't touch the pen to the paper. Instead, she set it down and placed her own simple, unassuming manila folder on top of the contract. Julian's smile faltered. "Elara, what is this? This isn't the time for sentiment. We're dealing with the future, not dusty old memories from the past." His voice held a clear note of irritation. "Some things belong in the background." Elara looked up, meeting his eyes directly for the first time that day. Her voice, when she spoke, was not loud, but it cut through the room with the clarity of a ringing bell. "You're right, Julian," she said, her tone calm and even. "Some things do belong in the background, but they are often the things holding everything else up." She paused, letting her words hang in the air. "For example," she continued, her voice gaining strength, "the fact that the land this entire company is built on was never owned by Sterling Industries. It was leased." A confused murmur rippled through the room. Richard scoffed. What nonsense are you talking about? Of course we own the land. No, Elara said simply. You don't. At that precise moment, as if on cue, the boardroom doors opened and Mr. Albright walked in. He was not a physically imposing man, but he carried with him an aura of unshakable integrity that immediately commanded attention. Mr. Albright, her father sputtered, his face turning a blotchy red. What are you doing here? You have no business with this company. On the contrary, Richard, Mr. Albright said, his voice calm and authoritative. I am here as the legal representative of the owner of this property. He walked to the table and placed his own leather-bound portfolio next to Elara's. With a deliberate slowness, he opened it and produced the original land survey and the 99-year lease agreement. As you can see, he said, his voice projecting to every corner of the room, this is a lease for Plot 7B, granted by Harold Sterling to Sterling Industries, a lease which, as of tomorrow, will have expired. The room fell into a stunned, profound silence. It was a silence so deep it felt heavier than any sound. The smirks vanished from the faces of the board members, replaced by masks of dawning horror. Julian's face had gone completely white, the color draining from it as if a plug had been pulled. Clara stared, her mouth slightly agape, her perfect composure finally cracking. There must be a renewal clause, one of the board members finally managed to choke out. There is, Mr. Albright confirmed. The lease can be renewed, but only at the sole discretion of the designated heir of Harold Sterling's personal land holdings. He then slid another document across the table, the codicil. An heir who was to be chosen by me, as executor. Richard lunged for the paper, his hands trembling. This is a forgery. It's a trick. It is perfectly legal and has been validated by the courts, Mr. Albright stated calmly. He then looked directly at Elara. As per Harold's wishes and my own judgment, the title for Plot 7B was transferred years ago. The sole owner of the land on which this building, your factories and your labs currently sit, is Elara Sterling. The silence that followed was different. It was no longer just shock. It was the sound of a world reordering itself, the sound of power shifting irrevocably from one side of the table to the other. The background detail had just become the entire landscape. Julian finally broke. The mask of charm and control shattered, revealing the desperate, greedy man beneath. You can't do this, he hissed, his voice a venomous whisper. He took a step toward Elara, his hand reaching for the documents. You little bitch, you've been planning this. Before he could take another step, two uniformed security guards, whom Mr. Albright had discreetly positioned outside, entered the room. They placed themselves between Julian and Elara. But Elara wasn't finished. She looked at the stunned faces of the board members, at the representatives from Titan Corp who had just arrived and were standing, frozen, in the doorway. The ownership of the land, unfortunately, is not the only problem this company faces, she announced, her voice resonating with newfound authority. She opened her own folder. My associate, Ms. Sarah Chen, a forensic accountant, has conducted a preliminary audit of the company's finances. She slid a thick bound report onto the table. This report details extensive financial mismanagement, including the embezzlement of over $3 million in corporate funds by Ms. Clara Sterling and Mr. Julian Croft for personal use. Clara let out a choked sob. Lies. It's all lies. The evidence, including bank statements, falsified invoices, and wire transfer confirmations, is all here, Elara said, her gaze sweeping over the room before landing on her father. A company, as my grandfather once said, begins to rot from the inside out the moment you compromise its integrity. You let the rot in, father. You nurtured it, and now it has consumed you. The Titan Corp executives didn't even wait for an explanation. The lead man just shook his head, turned on his heel, and walked out, his team trailing behind him. The merger was dead. The lifeline was gone. The boardroom erupted into chaos. Board members were shouting. Richard was slumped in his chair, his face ashen, looking like a man who had aged 20 years in 20 minutes. Clara was openly weeping, a messy, ugly sound. And Julian was just staring at Elara, his face a mixture of pure hatred and utter disbelief. He had underestimated her. They all had. They saw a quiet girl and assumed she was a simple one. They had mistaken stillness for weakness, and that mistake was about to cost them everything. In the midst of the pandemonium, Elara felt a profound calm. She had done it. She had honored her grandfather. She had taken back her life. The room was loud, filled with the sounds of their ruin, but in her heart there was only a quiet, satisfying silence. The fallout was immediate and catastrophic. The emergency board meeting that followed the chaotic merger announcement was less a meeting and more of a surrender. With the Titan deal vaporized and the company facing imminent eviction from its own premises, the board had no leverage. Richard was forced into an immediate and disgraceful resignation. Clara and Julian were suspended without pay, escorted from the building by security, their personal effects to be sent to them in boxes. The threat of criminal charges hung heavy in the air. The remaining board members, a group of shell-shocked men who had been loyal to Richard for years, turned to Elara. Their faces were a mixture of fear, desperation, and a dawning, grudging respect. She was no longer the quiet niece, the background detail. She was the landlord, the auditor, and the sole keeper of the company's future. "What do you want, Elara?" One of them, a man named Henderson, finally asked, his voice strained. Elara looked at them, her expression unreadable. She didn't want revenge, not in the petty, destructive way they would have understood. She wanted restoration. She wanted to rebuild what they had broken. "I want to save my grandfather's company," she said, her voice steady. "Here are my terms. First, a new lease will be drawn up, a fair market value lease, tying the company to this land for the next 50 years. This company will have a stable foundation again." They nodded, relieved. It was a start. "Second," she continued, "I will be appointed interim CEO, effective immediately. I will oversee a complete restructuring of the company from the top down. We will return to my grandfather's principles: quality, innovation, and integrity." There was a flicker of resistance in some of their eyes, but it died just as quickly. They had no choice. She held all the cards. "Oh, and third," she said, her voice dropping slightly, "Sterling Industries will pursue full criminal and civil charges against Clara Sterling and Julian Croft for embezzlement and fraud. There will be no golden parachutes. There will be no quiet settlements. There will be accountability." This was the part that was for her. The pound of flesh, not for the money, but for the betrayal, for the public humiliation, for every time they had made her feel small and worthless. Henderson nodded slowly. "The board agrees to your terms." Just like that, it was done. She walked out of that boardroom not as a victim, but as the leader. The employees she passed in the hallways looked at her with a new awareness. The whispers were already flying. The quiet, overlooked Sterling girl had just staged a corporate coup of staggering proportions. Later that day, sitting alone in the cavernous CEO office that had been her father's, Elara found a small, sealed envelope at the bottom of the box of her grandfather's things. It was addressed to her in his familiar script. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it. It was a letter. "My dearest Ellie," it began. "If you are reading this, it means the time has come. It means the jackals have finally tried to tear down the house I built. I am sorry to have left you this burden, but I knew you were the only one with the strength to carry it. Your father sees strength in noise, in bluster. Your sister sees it in glamour and attention. They are both wrong. True strength is quiet. It is patient. It is the deep root that holds the tree fast in a storm." Tears welled in Elara's eyes as she read the words he had written for her so long ago. "They have underestimated you your entire life. Good. Let them. An underestimated opponent is the most dangerous kind. You have my mind, Ellie, but you have your mother's heart, a combination that makes you far more powerful than any of them can comprehend. They chase the light, but you are the light. Don't ever let anyone convince you otherwise. Go on now. Rebuild it. Make it better. Make it yours." She folded the letter, holding it to her chest. It was the final piece of validation she needed. A blessing from the past, giving her permission to seize the future. The days that followed were a whirlwind of activity. The news of the failed merger and the Sterling family drama became the talk of the financial world. Julian and Clara were arrested. The sight of them being led from their lavish apartment in handcuffs was on every news channel. Their public disgrace was absolute. The wheels of justice, once set in motion by Elara's irrefutable evidence, ground forward with merciless efficiency. Elara, meanwhile, threw herself into the work of saving the company. She was ruthless in her efficiency. The cronies on the board were replaced. The vanity projects were scrapped. She walked the factory floor, talking to the engineers and technicians, people her father hadn't spoken to in years. She pulled out her grandfather's old journals and began implementing the processes he had designed, the innovations he had planned. It was hard, grueling work, but for the first time in her life she felt truly alive. She was not in anyone's shadow. She was building her own legacy on the foundation of the one she had saved. As a final act, not of mercy but of principle, she arranged for her father's legal bills to be paid from a personal account, not the company's. He would face his ruin, but he would face it with proper counsel. It was a small act of compassion that proved to herself that she was not like him. She was better. A year passed. Under Elara's leadership, Sterling Industries was transformed. Profits were up, but more importantly, morale was soaring. The company was once again known for its quality and innovation. She established the Harold Sterling Scholarship for young women in engineering, ensuring his legacy would nurture future generations. She had not just saved the company, she had given it a soul again. The legal battles concluded. Julian was sentenced to 5 years in a low-security prison for fraud. His charm had failed him in front of a jury. Clara, through a series of tearful apologies and a high-priced lawyer, avoided prison, but was left with a criminal record, crippling fines, and complete social ruin. She was a pariah in the circles she had once dominated. Her light had been extinguished. Richard lived in a small, quiet retirement community, a broken man haunted by his own hubris. He had lost his company, his reputation, and the respect of the only child who had ever truly understood his father's greatness. Elara had found her own rhythm, a life of purpose and quiet satisfaction. She had her work, her friendship with Sarah, and a sense of peace she had never known. She thought she was content. She didn't realize there was still a piece missing until he walked into her office. His name was Liam. He was a brilliant materials scientist from a prestigious research institute. He had requested a meeting, and his credentials were so impressive that Elara had taken it herself. He was tall and unassuming, with kind eyes and a quiet intensity that reminded her a little of her grandfather. He didn't start with flattery or business jargon. He started with a question. "I've been studying Harold Sterling's early patents," he said, his voice filled with genuine admiration. His work on polymer chains was decades ahead of its time, but there's a gap in his published research from 1978. I believe he solved the thermal degradation problem, but he never filed the patent. I was wondering if you knew why. Elara was stunned. No one had asked her a question that technical, that specific, in her entire life. She walked to the bookshelf in her office, the one where she now kept Harold's journals, and pulled out volume 7. She flipped to a page she knew by heart. "He did solve it," she said, turning the book so Liam could see the elegant hand-drawn formulas. But he found the resulting compound was too unstable for commercial application without a secondary stabilizer he couldn't synthesize at the time. He felt it was irresponsible to patent something so potentially volatile. Liam stared at the page, his eyes alight with understanding and excitement. Then he looked up at her, and for the first time, Elara felt truly seen by a man. He wasn't looking at a CEO or an heiress. He was looking at a mind, a peer. "I've been working on a new stabilizing agent," he said slowly. I think with your grandfather's formula and my stabilizer, we could create something revolutionary." That meeting was the beginning of everything else. Their relationship wasn't a whirlwind romance. It was a slow, steady construction built on a foundation of mutual respect and shared passion. He was fascinated by her knowledge, by the depth of her understanding. He had come looking for the ghost of Harold Sterling's genius, and he had found it, alive and well, in his granddaughter. He had come looking for the one left in the dark, not out of pity, but because he knew the most valuable things are often found away from the glare of the sun. They fell in love over blueprints and lab reports. He celebrated her intelligence, encouraged her vision, and loved her for the quiet strength she had always possessed. He never once made her feel like a background detail. To him, She was the whole picture. 2 years after she had walked into that boardroom, Elara stood with Liam on a catwalk overlooking the factory floor. A new wing of the facility was being dedicated, one built to produce the revolutionary new material they had created together. It was a testament to the past and a beacon for the future. She thought back to that night, to the humiliation and the despair. It seemed like a lifetime ago. She had lost a fiancé, a father, and a sister. But she had gained herself. She had learned that being underestimated was not a curse, but a superpower. It gave you the space to grow, to plan, to become stronger than anyone could ever imagine. True power wasn't about being the loudest voice in the room. It was about knowing the truth when no one else did, and having the patience to wait for the perfect moment to speak it. Liam squeezed her hand, his smile warm and genuine. "He would be so proud of you, you know," he said softly. Elara looked out at the thriving company, at the legacy she had reshaped into her own, and a deep, unshakable peace settled in her soul. She had spent a lifetime in the shadows, waiting for a light that was never meant for her, but she had learned that the dark is not an empty space. It's where the roots take hold. It's where the seeds of the future are sown. And she was finally, brilliantly in bloom.